Notice what the Russian command never sent. In the 12 hours that followed the first Ukrainian strike, no senior officer in the Donbas operational sector issued the consolidated situation report that should have moved up the chain to district headquarters by 0600. Not because the officers responsible were dead, although some were. Not because the communications had been destroyed, although several relays had been. The report did not move because no single staff in the sector possessed enough of the picture to assemble it. Each headquarters knew what had happened to itself. Each headquarters knew, in fragments, what had happened to one or two of its neighbors. None of them, in those first 12 hours, could describe what had happened to the sector as a whole, because the strikes that had occurred during the night had been distributed across the operational depth in a pattern that no single observation post had been positioned to see. By the time district headquarters began to assemble the picture itself, pulling fragments from a dozen subordinate commands and trying to reconcile them into something coherent, the operational tempo Russia had spent 6 weeks building toward the next offensive cycle was already lost. Not delayed, lost. And the men responsible for rebuilding it were the same men whose schedules, supplies, and assembly areas had just been rearranged for them by an opponent who appeared to understand the Russian operational rhythm better than the Russian staff did. This is not a story about a Ukrainian strike package hitting targets. This is a story about what happens when an attacker stops thinking about individual targets and starts thinking about the calendar an enemy is operating against. I have spent decades watching how offensive preparation actually works inside a large military formation, and I want to be precise about something at the outset. The preparation for a major operation is not a single event. It is a sequence of dependencies that have to converge at a specific point in time. Ammunition has to arrive at forward depots before the assault echelons can be issued their basic loads. Fuel has to be staged before the armor can be moved into final assembly areas. Bridging assets have to be positioned before the engineering effort can begin. Command elements have to be forward before the operation can be controlled. Each of these dependencies has a timeline, and each timeline has slack built into it, but the slack is not infinite. Disrupt the sequence at the right points, and the operation does not occur on schedule. Disrupt it at enough points, and the operation does not occur at all, because by the time the dependencies have been restored, the conditions that justified the operation have changed. What unfolded across the Donbas operational sector over a single overnight period is a case study in that kind of disruption. And by the time this analysis is finished, you will understand why the strikes were distributed the way they were distributed, why the absence of a coherent Russian response in the first 12 hours mattered more than the physical damage, and why the most dangerous condition for any operational commander is not losing equipment, it is losing the integrity of his preparation timeline at a moment when the timeline is the only thing his higher headquarters is measuring him against. Let me be direct about the original miscalculation, because it was not a miscalculation made by the officers commanding the affected sites. It was a miscalculation embedded in the way the Russian operational system had organized itself for sustained offensive pressure over the preceding year. The assumption was that the rear of the Donbas sector, the area between the line of contact and the administrative boundary further east, constituted a relatively secure operating zone. Not invulnerable, the Russian staff was not naive. They had absorbed sufficient losses to understand that Ukrainian deep strike capability existed and would be used. But the assumption was that the threat to the rear was a manageable threat, expressed through occasional strikes on high signature targets that could be hardened, dispersed, or protected through layered air defense. The operational rear was, in this conception, a place where preparation could be conducted with reasonable confidence that the preparation itself would survive long enough to produce the offensive output it was designed to produce. That reasoning is not irrational. Throughout military history, a defender's rear has been more secure than his front, and the depth of that security has been what allowed armies to generate and sustain offensive operations. The principle is sound. The problem is that this principle assumes the attacker has not built a strike architecture capable of treating the entire operational depth as a single target system rather than a collection of individual targets. And on this battlefield, the Ukrainian strike architecture had been doing exactly that for some time. The Russian command was operating inside a doctrinal framework that had not been updated to account for what the Ukrainian deep strike system had quietly become over the preceding 18 months. Here is what the Ukrainian campaign was actually doing in the weeks before that overnight operation, and this is where the analysis begins to matter. Ukrainian intelligence had been studying the Russian preparation cycle, not the individual depots, although those were tracked, not the individual headquarters, although those were located, the cycle itself, the pattern by which Russian forces in the Donbas were building toward their next major offensive push, which categories of supply were moving forward and when, which command elements were displacing and where, which engineering units were being assigned to which sectors, which signals were appearing on which frequencies as the preparation progressed. The Ukrainian planning staff was, in effect, building a model of the Russian operational metabolism, and that model was telling them when the system would be most exposed. This is a principle that every serious student of modern operational warfare must internalize. An offensive preparation derives its viability from two things working together: sequence and tempo. Remove either, and the preparation does not produce the operation it was designed to produce. A force that has its sequence disrupted can still generate combat power, but it cannot generate that power on the schedule its higher headquarters is depending on. A force that has its tempo disrupted can still meet its sequence requirements, but only by extending the timeline, which gives the enemy additional preparation time of his own. The Russian forces in the Donbas still had their depots, they still had their headquarters, their engineering assets, their forward staging areas, their accumulated supplies. What they were about to lose in a single overnight operation was the coherence of the preparation cycle that converted those resources into the next offensive operation. And the loss of coherence is harder to recover from than the loss of equipment, because equipment can be replaced from the strategic reserve, while coherence has to be rebuilt through the same staff work that had already taken 6 weeks to produce it the first time. But this is only the beginning of what went wrong. Because Ukraine was not simply attacking the Russian preparation cycle. Ukraine was attacking it in a sequence designed to exploit a specific feature of the Russian command system. There is a distinction in modern operational planning between attacking what an enemy has and attacking what an enemy is about to do. And the Ukrainian planners had decided that the latter was the more valuable currency in this engagement. The strikes that occurred during that overnight period were not targeted primarily against the most physically destructive options available. They were targeted against the most temporally destructive options. A specific ammunition depot that had been receiving deliveries for 10 days in preparation for the next push. A specific fuel staging area that was scheduled to begin issuing to combat units within 72 hours. A specific bridging park whose assets had been pre-positioned for an operation whose timing was now compromised by the absence of those assets. A specific signals node whose function was to coordinate the move forward of 3 reinforcing battalions over the coming week. This kind of targeting is harder to develop than it sounds. It requires intelligence that goes beyond identifying the location of military sites and extends into understanding the function those sites were about to perform in the operational timeline. It requires the willingness to bypass targets that might generate more visible destruction in favor of targets whose loss generates more meaningful disruption. It requires planners who think in terms of operational consequence rather than tactical impact. The Ukrainian command appeared to have made exactly that choice. The strikes that night were not the most spectacular strikes that could have been conducted with the available systems. They were the strikes most precisely calibrated to disrupt the Russian operational schedule at the points where the schedule was least redundant. The overnight phase began without the kind of preparatory indicators that defensive intelligence systems are configured to detect. There was no surge in Ukrainian reconnaissance flights over the Donbas in the preceding 12 hours. There was no observable concentration of Ukrainian strike assets near the line of contact. There was no electronic signature that distinguished that evening from the dozens of evenings that had preceded it. The strikes, when they arrived from multiple platforms operating from multiple launch positions across the Ukrainian operational depth, and they arrived within a compressed window of approximately 3 hours. Long-range systems struck the deepest targets first, before Russian air defense in the affected sectors had begun to fully process the threat. Drone strikes followed, exploiting the disruption to engage targets in the intermediate depth that would have been more difficult to address under undisturbed conditions. Loitering munitions worked the closest targets, including the assembly areas, where reinforcement traffic was already moving in preparation for the coming week's activity. What happens next changes everything. The Russian response to the opening strikes was professional within the constraints available to it. Air defense crews engaged what they could engage. Damage control teams were activated at the affected sites. Reports began moving up the chain through whatever communications remained functional. The problem was not that the Russian system failed to respond. The problem was that the response was being conducted by each affected element in isolation, because the connective tissue that would have integrated those responses had itself been struck. A signals node that should have been relaying situational reports between 3 regimental headquarters was no longer relaying anything. An engineering staff that should have been coordinating the redirection of damaged supply flows was no longer reachable by the depots that needed that coordination. An air defense command post that should have been retasking coverage to protect the most threatened remaining sites was itself displaced and reconstituting in a position from which it could not yet exercise effective command. Each of these gaps was, in itself, recoverable. The problem was that all of them existed simultaneously, and the recovery of each one was being delayed by the recovery of the others. And it gets worse from here, because the Russian command, when it began to understand the scope of what had occurred, responded with the measures that competent military forces are trained to apply in such conditions. Reserve communications assets were committed to restore the connective tissue. Engineering teams were redirected to assess and consolidate damaged supply stocks. Reinforcement was ordered forward from operational depth to compensate for the disruption in the affected sectors. None of this was incompetent. It was the response of a force that still had capability and still had professional officers attempting to stabilize a deteriorating preparation cycle under pressure. The underlying logic was correct. Identify the most critical gaps, fill them with available resources, and restore the timeline. The problem was that the timeline could not be restored on its original terms. The disruption was not the kind that could be sealed with replacement equipment and reissued orders. It was the kind that propagated through the operational system. A depot that loses 10 days of ammunition deliveries cannot be made whole by an emergency resupply, because the emergency resupply itself disrupts the schedules of other depots that were drawing from the same logistic network. A bridging park whose assets have been destroyed cannot be replaced by assets pulled from another sector without compromising the operation that other sector was preparing for. A signals architecture that has been rearranged cannot be reconstituted in 48 hours by staff officers who are simultaneously trying to manage the damage assessment, the casualty processing, the reinforcement coordination, and the upward reporting that district headquarters is demanding on an accelerated cycle. Each measure the Russian command applied to restore the situation generated its own second-order effects, and those effects were themselves consuming the staff bandwidth that would have been needed to manage the primary recovery. This is the doctrinal payoff I want every viewer to focus on, because it is the lesson that extends far beyond the Donbas. A modern operational system is not robust in the way that a fortified position is robust. A fortified position can absorb damage in one part of its structure without compromising the integrity of the other parts, because each bunker, each trench, each minefield is largely independent of the others. An operational system is the opposite. It is a network of dependencies, and damage to one node propagates through the network in ways that often exceed the physical extent of the damage itself. An attacker who understands this can produce strategic effect through tactical strikes, provided the strikes are sequenced and targeted with sufficient precision. An attacker who does not understand it will produce tactical damage that the defender absorbs and works around, often within days, with no lasting consequence to the larger operation. By the time the picture of the overnight strikes had been fully assembled at district headquarters, the offensive cycle that the Donbas sector had been preparing toward was no longer viable on its planned timeline. Not because the forces involved had been destroyed. The forces were largely intact. Not because the will to conduct the operation had failed. The will was present. The operation was no longer viable because the conditions for its successful execution had been removed, and those conditions could not be reconstituted within the window in which the operation had been politically and operationally justified. The decision to slip the timeline was made quietly, in the staff channels where such decisions are always made, and the new timeline reflected an understanding that the next several weeks would be spent rebuilding what one night had taken apart. The broader lesson here must not be reduced to a story about Ukrainian strike capability or Russian failure. The Russian forces in the Donbas were not incompetent. The Russian staff was not inattentive. The Russian air defense was not absent. What the Russian system was in the weeks before that overnight operation was an operational architecture built for a kind of conflict in which the rear was secure enough to allow the kind of methodical preparation that generates large offensive pushes. The Ukrainian campaign had finally demonstrated that the rear was no longer that kind of space. And the implication of that demonstration extends beyond this war, because every large army on every contested frontier in the world is currently operating on assumptions about rear area security that may not survive the kind of strike architecture Ukraine has now shown can be built and employed by a country with far less resource depth than the major powers. Modern operational warfare is no longer decided primarily by what happens at the line of contact. It is decided by whether the rear can sustain the preparation that allows the line of contact to be moved. A force whose rear has become a contested space is a force whose offensive cycles are subject to interruption. And a force whose offensive cycles are subject to interruption cannot conduct sustained operations on the timelines its political leadership requires. The Russian forces in the Donbas will rebuild what was lost. The depots will be replenished. The bridging assets will be replaced. The signals architecture will be reconstituted. The offensive cycle will eventually resume. But the assumption that the preparation could occur without serious risk of disruption has been disproven. And that disproof is itself a strategic event, because every future operation in the sector will now have to account for the possibility that the preparation itself can be attacked. The depots are quieter now. The bridging parks have been rebuilt or replaced. The signals nodes have been reconstituted. But the questions raised by that single overnight operation extend far beyond the Donbas, and they extend beyond this war. How many other operational rears in how many other armies are currently being treated as secure spaces under assumptions that have not been tested against a competent deep strike campaign? How many commanders are still measuring the security of their preparation by the distance from the front line rather than by the precision and reach of the systems their opponents have built? And how quickly can the lessons of one overnight in the Donbas be absorbed by the institutions and armies that will face similar conditions in the conflicts ahead before they discover, the way the staff officers at district headquarters discovered when they tried to assemble that morning report, that the rear had stopped being the rear some time ago, and that the assumption of preparation security had become the most dangerous assumption in their planning?